So I have to be next to the mic. I have to be here? Okay. Can we move this up just a little?
So good evening, everybody. We're pleased to introduce Greg Bugsby from the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, Office of Aquatic, or Invasive Aquatic Plant Program.
That's brief.
No further ado.
Nothing wrong with that, particularly since everybody knows me already.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
do live in Guilford and worked with the town. And I've served on the Conservation Commission for a lot of years, and it's certainly my pleasure to speak to you all. It's nice to give a talk that's close to my house as well. I'm going to give a talk today, and I'm looking forward to this because I have a little more time than I often have. A lot of talks I give. You go to these conferences, they'll give you 20 minutes or something, and it's sometimes difficult. But I'm going to be talking about sort of my experiences, in some cases maybe my opinions, some certainly science that I'm aware of when it comes to our invasive aquatic plants and the dangers that our lake face from these plants. So whenever I give these talks, there's often people in the audience that I want to get rid of the weeds, but they don't realize that plants are important, and aquatic plants are necessary for a good aquatic ecosystem. So it's important we realize that they are important and why they are important. First of all, they're food and habitat for wildlife. I'm going to show you in a minute a little video if it runs. Stabilizing sediments and improving water clarity. So again, you can find lakes around that have virtually no plants. We're going to talk why that could be. And they're often very turbid. There's a lot of sediment in the water. In many cases, they become algified because the nutrients are not being used by plants. So water clarity can be improved. And plants will remove nutrients. Again, plants, just like terrestrial plants, need nutrients. They obtain nutrients from both the sediment and from the water. And by removing nutrients from the water, you often will avoid algal blooms. And they also, to some extent, native species can help resist invasion from invasive species. We've done work, we've published work in journals showing that with our surveys throughout the state that those lakes with high diversity appear to be able to resist invasion for a while, but it's certainly not forever. This is a number which the Connecticut DEP gives us, and that is that 20 to 40% of what we call the littoral zone should have aquatic vegetation for a healthy ecosystem in Connecticut. What's the littoral zone? The littoral zone is that part of the lake where sunlight can reach the bottom and there's sediment that can support plants. Really deep lakes will not, in the deeper sections, light just can't get there, and that's not the littoral zone because plants cannot grow. We'll see what happens with this next slide here. And this is actually a video we took this year. This is actually an invasive species in a lake we were working on called Basin Lake in East Haddam. And they had we're going to be talking about some of these plants in a minute, a variable water milk oil issue, which we did some experiments with a new herbicide and got extremely good control. But another plant called fanwort began to show up there. And let's see what happens here. Okay, I don't think this is going to work. Anyways, if it did work, the video, you'd be going across this weed bed, and it's just a patch of what's called fanwort, and you'd see schools of fish, little fish, and there's big fish sort of eyeing them, and that sort of thing. There it is, all right. So you can see we're going over, look at all these fish. You believe that? And it almost looks like something you'd see in the Caribbean. And you'll see some of the bigger fish in there. And again, showing you the value of some plants. Now again, you can have way too many plants and you lose a lot of this value. And we're going to talk about that. But again, you can see, you know, in this case, this lake had very few plants because it had mainly milfoil before it was removed, and these few patches of fanwort were where these fish had to go. You know, this is where their habitat was, and that's why there's so much life. When we talk about invasive aquatic plants, most of you realize that there's ecosystem impacts, few natural controls, and that's why they can spread so rapidly and form what we call monostand in many instances, where there's nothing but these invasives. Displaced native species alter native ecosystems. Now, when we get calls at the ag station, and many of you were some, and I get the calls usually, it's almost never, oh wow, I'm losing my ecosystem. I'm losing, you know, the native species are being displaced. It's all mainly like, hey, I can't swim anymore. I can't, you know, I can't fish, I can't sail my boat. My property values are being reduced, you know, because of this. You know, and these are why we often will get the calls. And I think that's probably why our program is being supported, is because of this, the economic impacts. People seem to, when you hit people in their pocketbooks, they tend to be certainly more in favor of doing something. Interference with navigation is, we're going to talk about some work we've done on Connecticut River, where this is kind of a little bit of the case, but not really in Connecticut so much. The economic damages and management costs billions. Exactly how many billions in the United States is hard to say, but you know, even 1 acre of aquatic vegetation, invasive species, can easily cost $1,000 to treat it or to get rid of it and manage it a year. So again, the costs can really rise. I want to talk a little bit about how our lakes formed. We have a lot of lakes in Connecticut. How did they get there? Most of them got there by the actions of glaciers. These are natural lakes. Anybody know when the glaciers retreated? How many years ago?
20,000?
Close.
10.
About 10 to 12, 10. So all our lakes are probably no more than 10,000, 12,000 years old. Well, how did many of them form? Many we have what's called kettle lakes, and this slide shows a retreating glacier. And you got, anybody know how thick the ice was over us?
A mile.
Approximately a mile thick. Can you think? How many feet to a mile? 5,000. Okay, we're smart. So just think about how much ice was over us, and when it melted, and it melted pretty quickly. The outwash, big buried chunks of ice were in the outwash, and they got buried with sediment, and then when they melted, you get these lakes. And that's how a lot of our lakes have formed. Now, most lakes have some sort of a small dam or a dam that have raised them for various reasons, one of which is many of them were used for gathering ice back before we had modern refrigeration. So that's how the lakes formed, many of them anyway, most of them in Connecticut. And once that formation started, and once they formed, then the eutrophication process started. Eutrophication is the increase in nutrients that occurs in lakes. And this can occur naturally by plants dying, leaves falling into the water, falling to the bottom, creating organic material. That produces more plants. As the lake shallows, more plants, more nutrients, and you get eutrophication. We're going to talk a little bit about the fact the role of people in increasing eutrophication a little bit further along here. So that's the process of eutrophication. Lakes are not permanent. Again, we mentioned they started about 10,000 years ago, and now they've been eutrophied, and man-made activities have increased that eutrophication. But we can go to maps of the state of Connecticut and try to determine, okay, what is the current area of lakes and ponds? Now, a lake, depending upon if you're from the Great Lake area or from Connecticut, can be different. I live on Clear Lake. You go, well, that's 20 acres, and that's a lake. You know, you go to people, you know, along the Great Lakes, and they laugh. You know, so the difference between a lake and a pond is not necessarily well defined, but in this case, there is approximately 61,000 acres of lakes in Connecticut. The largest lake is Lake Candlewood. You can see it in the central western part of the state. That's a man-made lake that's used for hydrogeneration power. That's over 5,000 acres. But most of them are much smaller than that. The largest lake in the state is Bantam Lake, up in the northwest part of the state, Litchfield County. And as I said, many of our lakes are dammed and have increased in size because of dams. Well, you might say, okay, if that's true, the lakes are not permanent. How many lakes have we lost in the last 10,000 years? Have we lost any lakes? What percent of the lakes that were once here in Connecticut have been lost? And we can tell that by soil maps and soil types. There's box soils and that sort of thing. Anybody want to take a guess of what percentage of lakes that we once had have been lost? 80%? It's going to be about 50, a little over 50%. Let me show you, this is what we have now, and the red is what we've lost. Okay? So that has been lost. Well, how have it been lost? Let's look at a little more detail.
Since when?
Since in the last 10,000 years. They filled in.
10,000 years.
Right. All right, let's take a look at, I live on Clear Lake, and up north of us is West Lake. And I want you to look at a lake right here, a little pond. This is called West Hill Pond, right there. And look at the area here around it, okay? And we can tell by soil types, and this is what Kevin knows well, because a lot of our wetland maps are based upon soil types. And you can see there's a soil type, it's 18 here. That is what used to be a lake. That pond used to be much bigger, and now it is that small. If we look at it a little closer, this area right here is what used to be the West Hill Pond, and that has been lost in the last 10,000 years. And, you know, 10,000 years geologically is not a lot of time, but in a human life, it is a lot of time. So in an individual human life, the changes are not that great, but over time they are. So again, this is just to give the point that lakes are not permanent, and they need to be protected. They are essentially in peril, but for both natural reasons and unnatural reasons that man has created. This is an interesting slide. It's called the single most powerful image in the history of limnology. Limnology is really the study of lakes. And this was done back in the 70s, I believe, and it was done in a Canadian lake. And there was a controversy then going on about why lakes were turning green. Why were they algifying? Why were they getting these algal blooms? And the theory was that phosphorus was the limiting nutrient. A lot of the phosphorus was in detergents. And the manufacturers of detergents were saying, no, it's not phosphorus, it must be something else, nitrogen, even silicon or something was causing the algal blooms, not the phosphorus. So in Canada, where there's tons of lakes, and where in many cases nobody lives anywhere near, they said, okay, we're going to put this barrier, it's called a limno barrier, it goes to the bottom. We're going to section off 2 sections of the lake, we're going to add phosphorus to one side, and not phosphorus to the other side, and see what happens. And that's what happened. And it proved that really it was phosphorus that was the limiting nutrient for algae. Now, it's different from weeds. Weeds are not the same as algae. And in fact, as I mentioned before, if you get rid of weeds, you often get algae. And these cyanobacteria that cause this type of bloom actually create their own nitrogen. They don't need nitrogen from the water. So that's why phosphorus is the limiting nutrient, whereas plants need, and a lot of other organisms need nitrogen as well. Anyways, the point is, when we're talking about nutrient reduction, which is important, in many cases, it's an algal issue that's going to be affected and not plants. In fact, I was reading a paper today where we're going to talk about removing phosphorus from water a little bit in lakes if you have an algal bloom. And it showed in their paper that they cleared up the water, they made it so there's much less an algal bloom, but that resulted in increased aquatic vegetation because the water is clearing and the sediment's still on the bottom and the nutrients where the roots can go from these plants. So that's important. I show this next slide because this is something a lot of you probably have with ponds. This is called duckweed and watermeal. It's a small little plant watermeal is the smallest flowering plant on earth. But tiny, tiny plants that cover the top of the water. They are native and they are not algae. They can be controlled, but it is a native plant. I just want to show this slide, and this is, I kind of already brought this up, and this is when we're going to be talking about aquatic plant management a little bit. And it's basically this seesaw effect and a balancing act between algae and plants. Again, you control the plants, you'll get algae, many instances, not always, and if you have plants, you'll have much less algae. So it's this balancing act that we try to achieve to create a healthy lake that is neither high in algae or high in plants. This is the state list, and I don't want you to try to read it all, just want to show you what it looks like, of invasive aquatic plants. This is a state list, and the reason the state list is important is because they are banned from being sold, all except for one of these plants called water hyacinth. But they are banned from being sold in the aquarium trade or in water gardening, that sort of thing. So there's 22 of them. You might notice that one which you might expect to be on here called Phragmites is not, and that is because it is considered a terrestrial, believe it or not, and not an aquatic plant here. But other plants like, some of you may know of yellow iris, yellow flag iris, it's like an iris type plant, it's kind of a pretty plant that's around the shore, that is on it. But there's really a few that are most important, and if you look here, you see where it says dispersal. Well, that's how these plants are thought to get into water bodies, either through water gardening, aquariums, that sort of thing. Boat trailering, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the major ones we'll see here in Connecticut is this brittle water knife. I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute. Curly leaf pondweed, Eurasian water milfoil, fanwort, variable leaf milfoil, Brazilian waterweed, which is actually in Westlake. Is anybody here from Westlake? Oh, not Westlake, Fence Rock. Fence Rock, I'm sorry, Fence Rock. Are you here from Fence Rock Lake? No, okay. That's another lake in Guilford. Very rare to find that in Connecticut. And some of these other ones are hydrilla, which I'm going to show you in a minute, and water chestnut. Those are the ones that are the biggest problems. Just quickly go through these. We actually teach a workshop on how to identify these different plants. This is from them, but we're not going to give you a quiz at the end, as we might for some of the workshops. Eurasian water milfoil, this is kind of what it looks like. It has this spacing between the leaf whorls. And this fanwort, this is the one I showed you with the fish in it. Has the opposite branching with the fan-like look to the beautiful plants, aquarium plant. Curly pondweed has a lasagna-like look to the leaves. You usually see it in the spring. There are some lakes in Connecticut that have this problem. And then there's water chestnut, which is a floating plant that puts forth these nutlets that are extremely sharp, and if you step on them, you will puncture your foot. And there's hydrilla, which is a southern plant which has not been the biggest issue in Connecticut until in recent years. Just to show you, this is the Mattabesset River, and we worked on the Connecticut River. We got mid-2010s, we got some plants at the ag station that people did, they were from the Connecticut River. They were concerned of what they were. We looked at them. It kind of looked like what's called hydrilla. Again, this is the most problematic plant in the southern states. But in Connecticut, it's here, but it's never really been a problem. It's here in a few little ponds. It's in a couple reservoirs to the southwest part of the state. But we got into Connecticut River, and we were able to identify this plant as hydrilla. It had to be identified genetically. We had to send it off for DNA analysis. And it came back as a unique novel strain of hydrilla. When you do genetics on aquatic plants, you compare them to an internet site called GenBank, where the genetics of all these species are put in like a big library, and you can compare your sequences to determine what you have. And this hydrilla in the Connecticut River came back as hydrilla, but not closely related to anything else known anywhere in the world. This is just a video, and you can see my boat, you could see it. In the Mattabesset River, we had the drone up, and we were doing this drone footage. This is all hydrilla except for the center area to the shore. And I mentioned monostands, outcompetes everything else. Well, that's what we found. And we actually found, this is a, whoops, let me go back here. This is another site along the river. This is more like a lake, it's a cove. And if the video worked, it would be scanning around this, and you just see this dense cover of hydrilla. So this is a big issue, new to the state. We have not found this strain in any lakes yet, which is great, but we don't know why it isn't. It has been picked up by, a lot of the states are a lot better than us when it comes to having inspectors at boat ramps to make sure before a boat like Lake George and Lake Champlain, for instance, boats will be inspected before you're allowed to put them in. And both at Lake George and Lake Champlain, they picked up Connecticut River hydrilla by asking the people where they had been prior to coming on their boats before they were being launched in those lakes. So that's an issue. And again, this is a bad guy. We're very worried about this. And we're not only worried, this is a new wrinkle to the invasive aquatic plants. And that is that in the southern states, there have, associated with the hydrilla there is what's called a cyanobacteria that actually lives on the plant. And it is actually causing this neurotoxin baculoviminopathy. And eagles are dying, and waterfowl are dying, and it could even be harmful to people. This is a paper that was published in the journal Science last year. It won the Paper of the Year award, a very prestigious journal on this particular thing. So this is the first time health effects that I know of from invasive species are now being documented. We got to worry about that. Interestingly enough, we have a mosquito program at the agricultural station, and it's tempting to say, well, these plants are causing more mosquito issues, and none of the experts in mosquitoes seem to think that excessive plant growth would cause more mosquitoes. Maybe it's, maybe we'll prove them wrong, but that's what I'm getting. Now, we have this invasive plant guide, which we are currently getting our 4th edition. I have one here, it's one of my last copies, but you can download it if you want. And that'll go over all the plants and some management techniques and that sort of thing, so you can look at this type of thing in more detail. So I started the invasive aquatic plant program around 2002, maybe 2004, before it really got going. And we've been doing vegetation surveys throughout the state on lakes and ponds and now the Connecticut River ever since. I just happened to show, here I am in a boat. This is actually, I was at Lake Candlewood. We mapped the milfoil. We were mapping it every year there. This assistant at the bottom is throwing a grapple. I've essentially got to take plant samples with these grapples off the bottom. We have underwater cameras, we have sonar, we have computers on the boat, GIS systems, all that sort of thing to help. This is actually a map of Lake Quantapug. I believe we've done 4 full surveys of Lake Quantapug, as well as a lot of lesser surveys to monitor the effects of the weed management that's going on there. Lake Quantapug happens to be a highly diverse lake. You can see all the different colors indicating different plants. And, diversity is great. High diversity is generally considered when you have a large number of species that are relatively, each one is relatively abundant, meaning you don't have a lot of species, but one basically might be covering 99% of the bottom. Quantapug has great diversity. It has some issues which have been being dealt with for years and years and years. We're going to go over some of that in a minute. But we do surveys by mapping where the patches of plants are, and then we will put out, we have these transects that we've set out from our first survey. These are 10 georeference points coming up on the shore. We usually do one transect for every 10 acres of lake. I'm not sure how many we have here. We have a large number per. And that allows us to go back to those same points every time we do the survey and take bottom samples, take plants, identify what's there, the abundance at the points, and all that. And it allows us to do, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but to a lot of data analysis and comparisons statistically as to how things change. Now, again, I'm not going to, you see all in this chart, again, it's don't try to read the whole thing. These are the 4 surveys we've done on Lake Quantapug, the full survey of all the transects, 2004, 2010, 2015, and 2020. And then if we look at the graphs here on the right, you can see that, for instance, the red line is the invasive species by year. The percentage of the number of plants, species or inches per point. So, you might say 0.31 plants per point. How can it 0.31? Well, it's an average. It's a mean from all the points. And again, our points will often go into the deeper sections of the lake where, as we go out from shore, and these transects go out 80 meters from shore, so that's, that's about 250 feet. And so in many cases, we're in the deeper sections where there isn't plants. But we have to do that, go to there, because if it changes, say the water gets clearer, you may get plants there. So anyways, don't want to go into a lot of detail, but we have all sorts of reports. You can go to our webpage. We're going to show you in a bit where that is, and get the actual reports. And they all go to Kevin and others at the town for their review. So this is just a general map of Connecticut showing all the lakes we've surveyed as of, we haven't got the 2022 information up yet. We're working on that. So we've done, actually, through 392 lakes have been surveyed, my group. There's been a lot of them have been resurveyed, like Candlewood, so we've only, actually the number of actual lake surveys as of 2021 was, I can't see quite on my computer here, 256. So, and 55% of all our lakes and ponds have one or more invasive species. And we're going to talk a little bit about why in a minute. So how did they get there? We've done a lot of work. We've published on all this survey work gets published, and we have statisticians look at what's going on, what comparisons. And it certainly appears that boat launch sites and boat trailering is adding to the movement of plants. Interestingly, both invasive and native species. There seems to be more species in lakes and ponds that have boat launch ramps. And when our statisticians look at, for instance, some of those lakes must be maybe just bigger and therefore have more opportunity, it does bear out that this can be. This is actually, this trailer is actually Lake Quantapug, pulled out there, and you can see all the plants on the trailer. Most of these are actually native plants, but there's some invasives as well. And again, if this doesn't get clean, they go to another lake and launch the trailer, those plants are going to get in and get things going. Most of the invasive aquatic plants that I've mentioned so far have been at one point a aquarium plant. And we think that's really how a lot of these plants got going. Well, you might say, how do they get there from aquariums? Well, people get tired of their aquariums, unfortunately. It's not like your cat or your dog where you fall in love with you and can't get rid of it. People just say, I've had it, I don't want to deal with it anymore. and they go and dump everything. They don't want to kill anything, and, they want to set it free, and they go to a lake or a pond and let it go. We've actually found full aquariums, the whole thing. They throw the whole thing in. We actually have them in our greenhouse right now. We're growing some plants. They're nice ones. We found some nice aquariums that people throw the whole thing in the lake. There's water gardening and there's wildfowl. My guess is geese are going to spread propagules on their feathers and potentially through the gut. They goes in one end and out the other, and we've shown that a lot of seeds, a lot of invasives, particularly terrestrials, will go right through the gut of, say, a deer or a goose. And we had one scientist who was, in fact, he's Dr. Scott Williams, you may know him. He took on and published, he collected poop from the deer, and he had all this growing in pots in the greenhouse, and amazing what came forth. And he published that, and now he's our department head. Then that's the dispersal issue. This is, I just want to show you how fast some of these plants can spread. This is Fence Rock Lake. I don't know how many people know Fence Rock Lake in Guilford. It's just south of the Guilford Lakes. And we got a report of a strange weed. We went out there and determined this was what's called Brazilian waterweed. It kind of looks like hydrilla, but it isn't. It's just a different plant, and it's kind of rare, but we found it there. And in 2010 was sort of the first sighting, and if you look, we got a scientific name here called the Agaricus densa, but it's actually the Brazilian waterweed. You see the color there? Just look for that color. That's where in 2010 we found it when we got called out. The other colors are other plants. In 2011, 2012, 2013, and then we treated, we did an experiment with an herbicide in the lake in 2015. We were able to get rid of it. Again, a lot of the native species were kind of affected as well, which is not unusual. In 2017, still no Brazilian waterweed, and we noticed the natives are coming back. This is 2019, and we did see 2019 still coming back, natives, and then in 2021 we got called out again, and Agaricus was back again to some extent, and I hear it's been treated. So again, medications you don't get forever control with these, but that was a pretty good long-term control, at least for about 4 or 5 years. This is just, I don't know if this will even show this next slide here. We'll just wait a minute and see. Just try it one more time. This is what's called, where I work, we try a lot of different things, and some of the things work well, some of them not necessarily work well. We have a camera system on our boat, we have GPS systems and everything else, and our idea with this, when we try our experiments, is to try to do sort of the minimum damage to native species, and we decided to put, they were using an herbicide, and we decided to put the nozzle of the herbicide on the front of the camera, and let's see. And so this is great. We're putting out the herbicide. You can see we're going through the Brazilian waterweed, and right at the bottom, trying to keep it in just the areas where this is. Now there's going to be some movement of material off-site, no question. But one thing with this line of work is you occasionally have problems, and we hit a rock, and basically crashed and burned. So we had, anyway. So that's. The treatment worked, we had to fix it and go back, but the treatment worked really well. Some of the thinking was some of these herbicides will actually, if you put them at the surface, won't get to the bottom. And we've done some work to show that, and we thought this was the way to do it, and it actually worked very, very well. Let's see. Try to move to the next slide here. All right, let's talk about management. Okay, and some of the management techniques, are here. I'm going to go individually over some that I think are most important. The education one I think is important. Signage, talks like this, workshops, getting the word out. You've got to, clean, drain, and dry. You'll hear that terminology about boats. And just more of a, awareness of the problem can go a long way. So let's just talk about some management options. And I'm going to try to use a lot of examples that I've been involved with Guilford. And one thing people don't realize is Guilford, we're going to talk about dredging lakes, lake dredge. Do we have any here from Guilford Lakes? Okay, good, so you know. Let's talk about a few, what's going on in Guilford. Now this is actually West Lake, the new development here. This was, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. It was just a dredging of an area to make a beach. Okay, this is from the shore with a machine. Material is brought usually onto the shore and stored in sort of a drying lagoon or whatever you want to call it here. And this is sort of a localized dredging to remove sediment to improve swimming or that sort of thing. Doesn't really, as the lake on a whole, doesn't really do too much, but that's sort of a localized dredging. All right, now let's get into the fun stuff. Let's see. Is there anybody here from Dream Lake? No. Okay, well, this is Dream Lake. I believe is that Guilford or Madison?
Madison.
Right on the line. It's right on the line. Okay, so I was right. Well, I call Guilford the dredging capital of the East when it comes to a drain and dredge. And it's amazing how many lakes in Guilford where this has occurred. And it was all occurring in, when was Guilford Lakes dredged? 1980, 1990? 90s? Okay. There has been, let's just go through some and then we'll talk about the process. This is where you actually breach a dam, drain the lake, often put pumps in, and turn your lake into basically an excavation site for sand and gravel. And I can't tell you how many people are so envious of those people who have been through this. And I'm sure if you were there, you realize it wasn't easy. Getting support, dealing with the years of sometimes when your lake looks like this. But this is a way of removing the sediment. When you talk about that nutrient-rich organic material, getting rid of that, and then getting rid of a lot of the material beneath it, which at that time, when this was going on, had a fair amount of value. There was real estate boom, and there was need for sand and gravel and all that sort of stuff. So there was contractors that were willing to do this to lakes for virtually nothing, to just sell the material. So this process basically sets back the time clock of the lake from eutrophying the sediment to even maybe deeper than it was, definitely deeper than it was when it was formed 10,000 or so years ago. So this is Dream Lake. You can see sort of a stream, which is often a bermed area where water coming into the lake is going out to a small stream that was made, and then the excavation occurs. This is Mally's Pond. Anybody from Mally's Pond here? This is another one. We actually did a lot of survey work prior to the dredging. This pond was only 5 or 6 feet deep, and you can see all that. There was an island left in the middle, and there's a pump you can see pumping out the water. It's kind of green. This was made like 40 feet deep, and sort of 1.5 to begin with. And again, that reset the clock big time for this pond. Now, does this ring a bell? Is this lower or middle? Do you recall? This is Guilford Lake.
Can't tell from there. Looks like lower.
It's probably lower. Again, you can see the sand, the quality of the sand. It was pretty impressive. And the lake was set back to a previous condition with very little sediment and the nutrients in the sediment. We're going to show a slide in a little bit about what's called internal loading of nutrients in lakes, meaning you get nutrients in the sediment that are internally loaded. Even if you stop what's coming in, you can still have a lot of nutrients in that lake, just cycling back and forth each year from the sediment. But this obviously is a way to really, if you can do it. And again, it takes a lot of years, in many cases, a lot of complaints from people. In many cases, was yours a lake where the actual equipment got flooded, bulldozers and everything? Maybe that was now.
They went there.
At least one of them, all of a sudden it was heavy rain, and the equipment that they had in here ended up underwater. So there's issues like that. Now, I am getting calls from Guilford Lakes, and Guilford Lakes and one of the others.
Westlake.
What's that?
Probably Westlake?
Well, Westlake too, we'll talk about Westlake in a minute. But we're getting calls now that along the shore of Guilford Lakes, now you're getting things like lily pads, which were there before the dredging in the shallows, and now, so even, in the, as long as, these shallow areas are gonna get plants, particularly after 10, 20 years of maybe some sediment buildup, don't get leaves fall in, decay, you get a little more fertility there, and now you have these lily pads. And we're getting calls, okay, how do I get rid of the lily pads? The options are herbicides, hand removal, or mechanical removal, and that sort of thing. We're gonna go over some of these other techniques. But this is, again, a lot of the, and I've given talks all over the state, and people ask, well, how can I dredge my lake? Can I do it? And we give these examples. And the permitting involved and the difficulty in getting that thing going nowadays is extreme, and I don't know of any cases in Connecticut, maybe some, there where this is occurring anymore. It just seems very, very rare. So many of these Guilford Lakes were dredged this way. It's really pretty amazing. All right, I just want to move on to some other control techniques. And this is Lake Quanapog, and I'm sure you may recognize Rick Maynard there and some of his staff. We started, and this is actually an idea that Rick Maynard came up with. And, we worked with Rick Maynard in town for years, controlling weeds and doing testing in Quanapog and keeping the beach clear with various harvesting techniques and other ideas. But Rick came to me with this idea. He said, well, I've heard that if you put these bottom blankets on the weed beds, that you only need to have them there for 4 weeks and you can remove them. I said, yeah, right. These are tough weeds. You block light for 4 weeks. I guess as they might turn a little yellow and then just grow back when you remove the barrier. But I said, all right, I'm willing to go for this. Let's try it. The station will team up with the town. The town bought the barriers. The staff of the town put them together. You can see them here. They're white blankets, if you will. They're, in case of Guilford, they're 50 feet long and 10 feet wide with weighted rebar in sleeves every 5 feet long. So we decided to do some tests. All right, let's put them he bought, I think, 25 of these things, and we placed them in the beach area for Quanapog, and this was done in April. He wanted them out of there by Memorial Day when they opened the beach. So we put them in a month ahead, took them out for Memorial Day, and I'll be darned if they didn't work like a charm. Like a charm. We got weed-free beach area for the entire season, and may possibly beyond. We had been doing, other than this past year, we had been putting them out every year there. Now, that led to a lot, and now we have a lot of other lakes ask us about that, and we mentioned how well it worked, and now Lake Bezic is using them, Cedar Lake is using them, and we've even been trying them in the Connecticut River with success. And it's not, in the river, one thing about these barriers, they take about 10 minutes to settle slowly, and if you have flowing water, you may not know where they're going to actually end up. And in many cases, you're trying to overlap them just right. We're able to figure it out, but this is being used throughout the state, largely from the work that was done on Lake Quanapog and the success. So that's, I think, important to know. So let's go to the next slide. Now, I wanted to just talk a little bit about nutrient reduction, because I think there's a lot of kind of misnomers, people thinking things that maybe aren't particularly correct. But certainly, as I mentioned, nutrient reduction is something we don't want to not do. It's important. But again, nutrient reduction is likely to be more for algae control than aquatic plant control. I show a few things here, septic systems. You can see the green line there in the leach field next to the stream. That actually is right, goes into Clear Lake. That was 25 years ago, and I'm sure Kevin has solved that problem. So, you know, in my day, we always, there was a book called Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank. Well, that's one way you look for it. And, you know, there's been a lot of improvements in septic design and requirements and all that sort of thing that prevent these issues, but in many cases, septic systems are still kind of old around a lot of the lakes throughout the state, and this is something that needs to be addressed through pump outs, requirements every few years, and in some cases redesign of systems, and new systems that have been, the new system, some serious engineering that's going into a lot of systems that can be put on pretty small lots. Fertilizer we're going to talk about in a minute, and erosion, obviously that's more, you know, town controlling erosion, and I'm sure Guilford does a great job of making sure when construction happens, erosion is not occurring where sediment can get into the lakes. I have this slide showing the shallow lake versus the deep lake, and it's important that we realize there's a difference. And a lot of this has to do with, as I mentioned, nutrients get into sediment, and the deeper the lake, the less likely those nutrients are going to make it to the surface where the light is. And that's why some of the deepest lakes are the clearest lakes. Shallow lakes are much different. You have you know, sediment near the surface. You do tend to get less what we call anoxic conditions. Anoxic means no lack of oxygen, which will occur in the deeper lakes, but again, anoxia or low oxygen will cause a chemical reaction with the phosphorus in the sediment where it's what's called solubilizes and gets in the water. But as long as the lake is deep enough, you know, it may not ever mix with the surface. So there is some differences. Most of our lakes in Connecticut are shallow. They have to be treated as a shallow lake. But this issue with this internal loading is a big one, as I mentioned. That sediment is releasing nutrients each year and fueling plant growth. Just want to move on here. Okay, well, one thing which I showed here is you don't hear about much anymore is, anybody know what this general type of pollution is called where you have a pipe? It's called what? I'm sure point source pollution. Point sources have been, for a large part, cleaned up through the Clean Water Act and that sort of thing, and all the money that's been put into, an effort to put into, you know, you don't see pipes spewing yellow water and turning streams and lakes yellow anymore. So that's the good news, that just about all the point sources have been, when it comes to lakes, have been gotten rid of, but we still have, as suburbia has grown, a fair amount of what's called non-point sources. Now, one of those non-point sources is fertilizers. And the important thing with fertilizers is to remember that if it gets on the grass, this is obviously a bad job of fertilizing right here. Somebody was skipping every other, they didn't want to get out of there quick or something. Well, the point I want to make is when fertilizer gets on a lawn, lawns love fertilizer. Now this, I couldn't find the picture quickly enough for my talk today, but there's some pictures of where they've done experiments where they've done this same thing experimentally on a slope. And okay, you would expect to see movement of that green down slope if it was indeed moving. And very little of that happens. Again, fertilizer on lawns, I'm not saying go crazy with fertilizers on the lawn, but probably isn't going to move that much, and the lawn won't use it. Where the problem occurs in my mind is where you're using these rotary spreaders around parking areas, roads, sidewalks, driveways, and you see this all the time, fertilizer splattered all over the paved areas. The first rain, it's in the drain often will go to your lake or your pond, and that's a problem. You could get algae, you can get duckweed, water meal, which I mentioned, and issues like that. So that's important to realize. Effective January 2013 was Connecticut Public Act number 12-155. And what that stated was, no person shall apply any fertilizer that contains phosphate to an established lawn. Okay? Now, I show a bag of 28.8 fertilizer to show what you might have used to be able to get. Nowadays, you will not see that. That middle number is phosphorus, the percent by weight of the bag, that's phosphate. That is always basically zero now, except for the organic fertilizers where you can't get it out, and those are exempt. Because organic fertilizers, organic material is going to contain phosphorus. So anyways, no person shall apply fertilizer, that's by law now, and that's why the fertilizers no longer contain it. You also cannot find, you can't find any fertilizer that contains any lawn between November 15th and April 1st, and that is, and I'll tell you, let me just continue here. No person shall apply any fertilizer that contains phosphate to any lawn that is located 20 feet or less from the body of water. Fertilizer may be applied by to established lawns by soil test. Now, the exemptions for this are if you are seeding a new lawn, and people can get around it if they want, hey, I'm putting some seed in, therefore I can use phosphorus. But I really think that the removal of phosphorus from lawn fertilizers has gone a long way from keeping our lakes cleaner. I think we're going to see that, particularly less maybe algal blooms as we move forward. And we may be already seeing some of that. The agricultural station does soil testing. I run that lab, and if a soil test suggests you need fertilizer, phosphorus, you can do it. You have to test. Now, I have not seen any phosphorus police out there checking your bags and what you're doing, but that's a law that's currently there. All right, let's talk about some other things that can be done to manage. This is what's called the drawdown technique. Here I am at Lake Bezic. We're putting some sensors in the bottom, sensing temperature and moisture. They do a drawdown each winter. We alternate between a deep one and a shallow one. It can be anywhere from a couple feet to 6 feet there. Deep, where they expose the bottom, and this will freeze the weeds. And it works pretty well, but we generally find that it's short-lived, meaning the root systems and the propagules are not usually controlled well, and they do grow back. This is done also in Lake Candlewood, let's see here. Let's try this. Okay. Lake Candlewood uses drawdowns anywhere from 6 feet to 12 feet for weed control, and again works good in the short term, but not so good in the long term. So it's kind of a cosmetic type of thing. Now, again, I've already kind of showed this, but prevention is important. Here's the trailer again at Lake Quantipoc, which I've used it for probably 20 years in talks. And again, we give workshops, and again, we can give workshops to towns on how to identify plants, and we actually bring plant samples out in live plant samples. We'll go over, often using, we have them, we'll give out these, and we go by this, and people identify them. And that helps, there's a term called early detection and rapid response. And by being able to identify these things, and we see this in several lakes where there's what's called, a fair number of what we call citizen scientists who know what they're kind of looking for, or at least know to send a sample to us or take a picture of it if they think something might be not native. So prevention is obviously the best if you can do it, prevent the problem before it happens. It's not easy. It's just not. I mean, making sure a boat is clean from every propagule, where you got, it could be up inside a motor's cooling system. It could be, in a bilge. It could be somewhere, that's difficult to find, so it's not perfect, but prevention is certainly the gold standard if we can do it to keep things out. All right, let's talk about a little bit about harvesting, because this comes into another issue and another, some work that's been done on Quantapug. Harvesting can take many, many types from, you can see the top left here is, I think it's called the hydro rake that happens to be being done in the south end of Lake Quantapug. Here's me and a younger me with, we were testing this electric hedge trimmer, underwater hedge trimmer, at the beach area of Lake Quantapug, and cutting and then collecting, and you know, do that a couple times a year. It actually worked pretty well, but it was work, and you know, not for everybody. One year in Lake Quantapug, I should have showed the picture. Rick called and said, you know, there's still a few patches of weeds in the beach area. So I happen to be a scuba diver. So I said, all right, I got my scuba gear and got some hand hedge trimmers and went in there and started cutting. My wife thought I was nuts, but it worked. So, you know, harvesting is a method. There's also mechanical harvesting. You see bottom right here. That's where a machine actually uses Lake Zor, taking Eurasian milfoil and bringing it up on, cutting it, bringing it up on a conveyor, and then taking it away. In the bottom left is what's called suction, diver-assisted suction harvesting of plants. There's a little bubble, as you can see. This is a machine with a tube that goes down. There's a diver down there, and he's vacuuming up the weeds. It didn't work well. It didn't end that well. Basically, the problem with that is even in this really clear lake, the water bucked up very quickly, and they were flailing around a bit, and all of a sudden there's little fragments of, we were trying to get rid of fanwort, you know, floating away, and I'm trying to catch them and take them back. But the methods are best for short-term control. The long-term control, basically you're trying to wear them out by cutting them so much. The problem is they often wear you out, and then you call me and somebody and say, what do I do? But there's Moodus Reservoir has a new weed harvester. We work with Patchogue Pond, and they have a harvester as well, and it's usually the retired guys. I got my harvester, you know, and it's a machine like this, and they're all drooling to use it, you know, and they're having some fun. But it can be effective, but it's not perfect. This is again Lake Quantapug. This is the south end of Lake Quantapug, and it's amazing how much work has been done on Lake Quantapug over the years. And this south end of Lake Quantapug, you know, there's records going back to the 40s, which describe the south end almost exactly as it is now, completely engulfed in lily pads. It's just very shallow and mucked in. But people want to use that, you know, get down the south end, kayak down there, and there's been a lot of efforts to try to keep it clear so it has public access. There's also some docks down there. This was 2002, where we brought in there's actually a harvester in what's called a hydro rake. This is the hydro rake here, that's the harvester there. This is like a rake that pulls up lily pads by the roots, and then they deposit them in the back of that harvester, which is like a little truck back there. And they were taken away, and then the town had I think the town, Public Works, had a backhoe and a truck, and they were taking the material away. This was done, I believe, in like late August, and it looked great in October, but again, weeds are dying back anyway. The following year, there was issues with what's called floating islands of muck, and a lot of regrowth of, this is fanwort. Some of the floating islands of muck actually began to produce a fair amount of wetland plants like sedges and that sort of thing. You can see here, that's a floating island. So again, not everything works well, but we don't give up. And unfortunately, there's a lot of invasives. You know, the disruption of lily pads, which blocks the light, allowed this fanwort invasive species to take hold, and even to this day, it's there and it's being treated. Right now, there's, the town is using some herbicides down there to keep it clear. And works reasonably well. All right, so I already mentioned benthic barriers, so I'm not going to go into much more detail there. Let's go right to biocontrols. And there's really only one biocontrol that's being used. We've tried other ones. We've tried weevils that were, there's what's called a Eurasian water milfoil weevil. And the idea was that you could put these weevils into, in this case, Candlewood Lake with Eurasian water milfoil problems, and control, get these populations build of the weevils, which would then eat the milfoil, and you would have much reduction, and it would be selective. So again, we did some testing. Unfortunately, these weevils you can't get as a weevil meaning an insect that you see around. All you can get them as eggs. Now, the eggs, you can't see the eggs. So, and the eggs come on clumps of milfoil from the Midwest. So you gotta take these milfoil and assume that the eggs are there, put them in the lake, and hope the weevils persist. Well, they didn't persist, and we gave up on that idea. They were $1 an egg. So, that was another try, which didn't work well. But anyways, grass carp. These are fish that are introduced into lakes and ponds. They are herbivores, meaning they eat vegetation and nothing else. They are thought to be basically non-selective, meaning they would potentially eat both native and invasive species. But Connecticut is one state which allows grass. Some states will not allow them. These are triploid grass carp, meaning that they have an extra set of chromosomes and therefore can't reproduce. So they don't want to put something in the environment that's going to reproduce and milk them.
Really different problem.
Yeah, so these are, I don't know who checks each one to make sure that, but we are told that they cannot reproduce. And it's a blood test that would need to be done, but evidently this is the truth. This is the case, they are sterile. So initially they were mainly used in golf course ponds and small ponds, but over time, because of the weed problems in Connecticut, the DEP became pretty lenient compared to most environmental protection agencies in other states in allowing them to be used. And they started to be allowed to be used in some of the larger lakes. Now, first lake they were put in the larger lake was Ball Pond. Probably you're not familiar with that one. It's out in the western part of the state. And then they were eventually allowed to be put in Candlewood Lake. Now, Candlewood Lake is, again, the largest lake in the state. We've surveyed it for years. It had over 500 acres of milfoil. I got another slide I'm going to go into in a minute, so I'm going to tell you what happened. But let's just go show you some examples of these fish. They can be put in pond. This is called Lake Wabeeka, another lake we've been working on in Danbury. And it had major issues with plants. It's a shallow lake, and had a lot of issues with what's called coontail and some of the pond weeds, and some milfoil, Eurasian water milfoil. So they asked our DEP for a permit to release grass carp, and they got it. So they were released, and this is from 2019. So this is what? Let's go back. This is 2005. 2019, we were called back and asked to take a look at the lake, and basically the only thing left was water lilies. And we know that water lilies is what we call an immersed plant. The grass carp don't really like them. So everything else was pretty much gone. And this is something that we, are seeing now where, and the problem is that people, they'll get a permit for grass carp, they'll wait 5 years, 3, 4, 5 years, and they say nothing's happening. Well, the grass carp go in small, they're only like 12 inches long, and then they get big. And they go back for more grass carp after 3, 4, 5 years, saying nothing's happening, and DEP will give them it, say, okay, we'll give you more. And then 7 years later, where's our plants? They're all gone. And this is what happened here. This is, this is too much. Well, we didn't know that this was gonna happen. I mean, and again, we did another survey here, and again, water lilies are increasing, but everything else is gone. Candlewood Lake, so this is the issue with Candlewood Lake. This was extremely surprising. Again, we've surveyed this lake for over a decade every year. And, they do a drawdown and you get some variability in water, milfoil acreage, depending on how deep the lake went down, how long, and how cold the winter was. But milfoil would vary between 250 and 500 something acres. And this was consistent. They put grass carp in, 3,868 grass carp in 2015. And again, here it is 2017. It's only 2 years later. They said, wait a minute, nothing's happening. So they went and they put another 5,000 in. And still, you can see some of these pictures up top. I mean, the milfoil was intense. I mean, it was, in many cases, it was 10 feet high in deep water to the surface and topped out. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, you got close to 10,000 fish in here, and you got, all this acreage. That's a lot of eating, even for that many fish. And sure enough, nothing happened until this past year. And you can see with the red line on the graph here, where again you had this deep, it was a shallow drawdown, deep drawdown, shallow drawdown, alternate years. And we had 450 acres last year, and then this year, 0, nothing. No plants left in the lake. The largest lake in the state. There's nothing.
What happens to all the carp?
Well, that's a good question. What happens to the carp? Well, they get hungry, number one, but they seem to find something to eat. It can be algae, it can be, vat-forming algae, it can be weed trees from leaves that are, from trees that are maybe fallen into the lake. The problem with grass carp is once they're in you, there's really no good way to determine how many remain. There's got to be some mortality, but we don't know what it is. So you never really know how many are there. And that's part of the problem with when you reintroduce, you make assumptions because nothing is happening, that maybe there's not many there, when in reality they're there. And they have, and so this is something we've got to come to grips with in the state, that all these large lakes where the grass carp have been introduced have near total loss of plants. In some cases, that causes algae and green water. Candlewood Lake is so big and so deep, as I showed in the previous slide, that we don't think that is occurring there. And the water doesn't seem to be algified, even though the plants are gone. Now, the problem with plants being gone is a lot of people want to swim. Yay, great, as I mentioned, the ecosystem really isn't of concern. The problem is there's fishermen involved. Fishermen like plants. I mean, they don't want complete coverage or they can't access anything, but they love weed lines, weed beds, and this is where the complaints occur. Candlewood Lake is a trophy bass lake, listed as one of the better ones in the country, and now everybody's concerned with no plants, what's going to happen to them. There's evidence to suggest that in the short term you may actually get bigger fish because the fry have no place to hide. The big fish can eat them. But after that, there could be declines. So again, grass carp are a tool, but they are not perfect, and I think the DEP is going to begin to crack down a little bit on their introduction based upon what we're seeing here. So let's move on to some controversial stuff. And this is regarding herbicides. Herbicides are a chemical, usually, I don't think of any that aren't, that kill plants. They have some advantages. They can be quick acting, they can be targetable. There are some herbicides that will only affect certain plants, not others, much like you can get rid of dandelions in your lawn and not kill your grass. A lot of the aquatic plants are a form of the grass. The pondweeds, they're what's called monocots versus dicots that are your broadleaf plants. So you can often control some selectively. They're often viewed by some as a panacea, which is, I'm calling it a troll, but they aren't. And I think we can say they are reasonably effective, but they are not often long-term controls. We did some work in Patient Lake, as I mentioned, with a product called Cor, and it did give long-term control, which was great, and allowed the natives to occur. Now, there are cons to herbicides, and I'm sure many of you know of these. One thing, if you want to create controversy in some lake associations, mention an herbicide. And I've been to some lake association meetings, and you get to some that say, nuke it, hey, get rid of everything, the more the better, and use twice as much if you have to of the herbicide. But others will say, no way, no how, and all of a sudden you have arguments in the audience about vaccines, about big pharma being, all this, and I'm standing here just going, okay, maybe I shouldn't be here. But certainly there are some advantages, and people's philosophy regarding herbicides varies a lot. And your emotion will never change people's philosophies on this. That's one thing I've learned the hard way. I try to just give factual information, all the options, but so it's difficult. There's going to be, the cost involved can be high. Like I said, some of these herbicides, it's $1,000 an acre to treat, and you may have to do it frequently. Coventry Lake has hydrilla in the lake. They've been treating that lake for hydrilla for probably 10 years. Every year, they're getting some state funding to do it, and it's $100,000 a year for that lake. The state kicks in $50,000, and the town comes up with $50,000. So some of these costs are amazing. And again, you don't want to get in a situation where you're doing something every year with that, if you can avoid it. And again, collateral damage, damage to native species can be an issue. And again, if you get rid of native species, there are some species of plants that are extremely beneficial. There's one in Lake Quannapock, it's called Robin's Pondweed. It's like a fern, covers the bottom, it grows maybe this tall. It's one of my favorite plants. Fish are in it, you can see with the cameras, fish, bag bass are in there hiding. And it doesn't really harm anything. And it covers the bottom, it does a lot of good things. And if you get rid of all that coverage at the bottom, you're trying to control some patches of milfoil, you get rid of large areas of this, say Robin's pondweed, now you can open up that sediment to the aggressive invasive species. As I said, some of these native species can resist invasion to a great extent. So herbicides are controversial, and and we have Westlake people here, correct? Okay, so you know this legislation, I think, that has been passed. So this is legislation that largely came from the Westlake group, various lake associations there, that we now, for businesses that are applying herbicides to lakes and ponds, it's going to be much more strict now. And we're still trying to sort this out. Don't try to read everything. But the bottom line with this legislation was passed, and let me give you some history and correct me if I'm wrong. In the case of Westlake, there was an applicator. And there's more to it, I'm sure, that I'm gonna be able to tell, because there's various lake associations, and I believe some felt they weren't being notified of what was going on, and maybe didn't approve what was going on. Anyways, there's a number of lake associations around this lake. There was a request and a permit filed to treat the lake for weeds with an herbicide. And the contractor got the permit from DEEP, and it was reviewed, I'm sure, by wetlands to some extent. Any permit for treating a lake or a pond the permit has to be given to your wetlands agency at the town for review. Now, they can't categorically deny it, but they can approach DEP, which can deny it and make a case to deny it. And if I'm wrong, correct me. So in the case of Westlake, a contractor got a permit to treat the lake. And he did everything according to the law, as far as I know, to notify, which means putting it in the paper and posting it in conspicuous locations where people go. Now, the problem with the paper was he just gave a ton of dates when he might be applying it.
There were 72 days.
72 different days, which is basically, he could be applying at any of these 72
Yeah,
days.
exactly.
And that met the letter of the law apparently, but it didn't go over well with people who wanted to really know what was going on and when things were applied. So, so it happens that Christine Cohen, Senator Christine Cohen, is chair of the Environment Committee in Hartford, and she's local. And there was concern to reach her office regarding this. How could it be improved? How could notification be improved? And that sort of thing. So there was legislation proposed to tighten up the notification. This is how it came out. And basically what it says, again, if you are a business, now if you're not a business, apparently doesn't apply, but it says here, if you're any pesticide application business, prior to making a pesticide application, must do the following things. And what it says now is you must reach out to every owner around the lake, tell them what you're applying, no less than 24 hours ahead of time, make 2 attempts to do that, and a few other things here, and that will cover you. Now, there's questions about how this, and I think the contractors and the pesticide applicators are trying to get a feel for how this might work, and I know questions went into DEP. They had actually consulted their lawyers. What does this mean? Well, what it means, again, for these application businesses is the way this is written, you have to notify every land abutting owner twice. I think what they meant was that you try at least twice, but the way it's written is you have to notify everybody twice, which is going to be a problem, I think, for a lot of these contractors. I mean, think of the Connecticut River. If ever doing treatment of the hydrilla, how do you got to find these people? The lawyers did say you could have, email will do, but you need a reply from the email saying that they got it. Texting is not allowed for some reason. So I think this has still got to be a work in progress, but I'm hoping it isn't a situation where all the herbicide contractors this year say, I can't do it. It's just so difficult, and all of a sudden none of this stuff can happen anymore. So we'll see on that. I'm not sure how it's going to go. I've talked to some contractors, and they're not sure yet how this is going to go, but it sure seems restrictive. My idea, and I talked with the legislative assistants who called me and asked my opinion, he said, I really think this should be done very similar to the arborists, where if you want to be notified, you get put on a registry. And what lake you're on, I want to be notified of any pesticide application. You're on this registry, and then you will be notified. I think they want much more tighter than that. So we'll see where this goes, but this is something that, again, was, I think...
Greg,
Yes.
I think the primary reason that we all got together and we were upset with that is because our children and grandchildren would be swimming in the lake not knowing that they were pouring herbicides that day.
Right, right,
And it's unconscionable.
right.
This is a little clumsy, but it had to be somewhere between, you know, what was happening legally and this, but I mean.
I agree. I think, well, yeah, I think it's gonna have to be tightened somehow.
Yeah.
But it's a start, and I think, again, the way it was before was not acceptable.
No.
So, where you give 72 dates and say you could be there anytime during the summer.
Yeah, I put it in the Simply Guilford and it just blew up.
So, again, Guilford has been very active, very proactive in a lot of things, whether it's dredging, whether it's herbicide applications, whether, it's amazing this little town that I happen to live in is been so proactive. So that's there. Now, there's always hope. This is something which has come up. Disappearing Act. Biologists hopeful that research study will explain why hydrilla in Texas lakes has disappeared. Why did hydrilla and other vegetation vanish? Again, the problem here was, for some reason, these plants died out. And as far as we know, it wasn't due to grass carp, but in some cases, lakes can lose their vegetation. Now, this case, the problem was the fishermen here, you can see he's pulling up a bass that has hydrilla all over it. They love the hydrilla, the bass fishermen. So that is an issue. That, you know, I've not seen that in Connecticut. There's some thought that maybe the Candlewood Lake loss of vegetation might have some explanation beyond just the grass carp. There's some sort of symbiosis between something, whether there's a disease of plants or whatever, that occurs along with grass carp. But this is something that is occurring as well, but rarely. I haven't seen it in Connecticut other than any other of these lakes where they have grass carp. I just want to bring this up before I close and take questions, that there are grants available from DEP. As many of you people may be aware that whenever you register a boat now, there's a, I believe it's $5, maybe one up. There's a fee, invasive aquatic plant fee associated with every boat registration. And it's more for out-of-staters who come in to use their boats here. And this goes into a pot usually somewhere near $500,000 DEP has. And they will dole it out via an RFP, a request for proposal, to those they feel that the proposal is worthy of funding. Last year they did, I'm not sure, like 15 awards ranging from $50,000 to $3,000. For those of us on private lakes, it's difficult. I'll be very frank with you. Westlake, Clear Lake, you know, all these lakes are private. You know, they don't usually give funding to private lakes. They want more to those lakes that the taxpayers have access to, you know, freely. So you'll see it more going to those who, but it's not impossible, but it's sometimes difficult for the private lakes to get their share here. So again, you can go to the DEP website, type in invasive aquatic plant grant, and see when the RFP is coming out and learn all about it. The way it works is, you will, if awarded, you will get 50% of the funds up front, and then when you show you've done whatever you said you're going to do, you get the next 50%. I will say there's been issues with the funding. The Ag Station initially applied for some. It was set up to help fund our program, because at that time we were short on funding, as well as others. We applied for some to do our Connecticut River Survey work, and we got it. We also got some to redo the invasive plant guide. And in that case, we were told you got it, and a lot of people say, you got the funds, okay, great. So we did the work, and then they said, wait a minute, you never got the official award. The official award is still to come. It's been held up in the Attorney General's office, or I don't know what. And so, ended up, and you can't get funded for work that was done prior to getting the official award. So a lot of us did work and weren't, and thought we were gonna get funded, and then we realized that we didn't. And fortunately, we put it forth to the next year and did more work the following year. But some people, it got a little bit dicey where they did work and had trouble getting funded. I heard some cases, some of this, it was back invoiced, it worked out, but there's still hitches with the funding, and even to this day, there's still hitches. And I hear it's not with DEP, it's more with the Attorney General's office and make sure the wording is right and all this sort of thing. So that is there, and you can certainly go there if you want to try to get some funding for your work. So I just want to end, show, again, this is our webpage. The webpage over the last 20 years has become extremely robust. For instance, we have all the maps of all the 400 lakes. You can see the maps, the interactive maps. You can, when we do these surveys, every year we do them, we take one plant of each species we find in each lake, we mount it and dry mount it in our herbarium and do digitize the mount, so you can actually go and see the dry mount of all the plants in your lake. If there's a question as to what we found, you can go to the mountain. Okay, is it or is it not? We've actually done some work with some genetics on the mounts. So if there's a question, we can actually take dried mount plant material and have it genetically analyzed if there's a question. There is a lot of the issues with plants come regarding what we call state listed species. And Lake Quanticook has 2 that we know of in the lake. And they can be extremely difficult to identify and extremely rare. There's one plant in Lake Quanticook, it's called the capillary pondweed, scientific name Potamogeton gymnivorous. And it is literally the width of a human hair, and extremely difficult to find. And in the south section of Lake Quanticook, a lot of the methods are still being used have to show that that particular plant will be protected. Now, we have not been able to find it there for close to 20 years, but once something is found, it often stays in the records and needs to be protected. It's extremely difficult. You can see Lake Quanticook with all those lily pads. Imagine trying to look under lily pads for human hair type plant. It's very difficult to assure 100% that a plant that was once there is not there. All right. Basically, I've gotten a hook.
We're all getting the hook.
All right.
They need to
So
lock
can we
up.
take any questions? Or are we done?
By 10 of, we have to walk out the door.
Okay, so we've got 6 minutes for questions. All right, let's see. We'll go in the back first. Yeah.
Hi, I live on Guilford Lakes, and our association has been discussing some of the issues about the, I guess they're called lily pads.
Right.
And I remember you said in your lecture that elimination of lily pads causes, if you eliminate them entirely, it causes something else to grow. And I can't remember what it was, which plant you said or what.
Well, again, it depends on what's there, what submersed plant is there. Now, again, and you have to look at what other, if you did a survey of the lake, you'd say, okay, what other plants are there and what's likely to take it. If you had Eurasian watermill foil or fanwort, there would be a really good chance you'd get that instead.
Right. Okay, so we're getting back to the whole concept of balance, which you feel is really important, in terms of the ecosystem. How do you determine, how many lily pads do you keep? How many are considered to be too much? What would damage the lake or interrupt the ecosystem or hurt its integrity? How do you
Okay.
determine that?
So
Because
I'll
we're
repeat the
we're trying
question for the
to
audience
decide.
that's on video. So the question is, how do you determine balance? How do you determine, a lot of that is, somewhat subjective. For instance, I live on Clear Lake, so I manage that lake. We have an area of lily pads we keep for habitat and that sort of thing. And, we have a 20-acre lake, it's probably a half an acre. Now, I think, again, and you have to deal with people and where their homes are, and if they want to, easy access versus lily pad areas. So there's not a definitive number of that. But certainly, it should be, for a lake like Guilford Lakes, one of those lakes, I would think you'd want an acre of lily pads, if I had to say something off my head, top of my head. The question is, whose house are they off? Who gets them? That's gonna be the problem. Yes?
Thank you.
How does the lake get into the survey program? I don't know if Guilford Lakes have been surveyed, have they?
All right, so the question is, how do you get into the survey program? When you go to the webpage, and you can see here, it says surveys, where does it say it? Somewhere.
The bottom.
Request a survey. You click on that, and you fill out a form and send it in. Now, we're gonna try to, we were, prior to getting some funding this year, requesting reimbursements for our costs. I think that's gonna get much more minimal now, so we're probably gonna have more requests than ever. But I would go to that form, and I think we have done some surveys of Guilford Lake, I think maybe even pre-dredging it. Well, we did the upper lake, which I think was not dredged. But I would go in there and make a request. I think that's something we could easily do.
Thank you.
Is it possible to get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation?
So the question is yes, we can get you a copy. I don't know if the library has a means, or I can send it to Kevin, or I can send it to you personally. If you want, just shoot me an email. I can give you my business card with my email. But just do that. I'm gonna have to, what's called PDF it, meaning the videos won't work, but because the file's huge, I can't send the file as is. But we can get that, or, sometimes the town or the library has a website they want it on, we have to give it to you.
How about just specific parts? I'm most interested in the restrictions on fertilizers and how they affect.
Okay, yeah, we could do that. I think I could probably get you the whole thing. Once you PDF it, it gets quite small.
Okay.
Correct, once you do it, put it up on the Conservation Commission webpage too, as a
Okay,
for reference.
all right, so I can send it to you?
Yeah, you can send it to me, and put
Okay.
the PDF to us, and then we put it up there.
All right, so I'll send it to that as well, but I'll give you my card and I'll have to send it off to you. Anything else?
I think we have a minute left.
The underwater tarps for 20-day, is that still being used? And does it depend on when in the year you put it down for 20 days?
The question is about the bottom blankets, are they still being used? We are gonna use them as far as I know in Guilford this year. We didn't do it last year, and there were some bleed issues we had to deal with some cutting. So, yeah, they are still being used. They use, like Basic and all these other ones are still using them, so very effectively.
That's the kind of range during-
So the question is, when do they apply them? Again, we find it's best to apply them early. If you wait too long and you're trying to overlap them a little bit, like we do to make a bigger area, often the vegetation is pretty tall, and as you drop them, it sort of flops and then comes up along the side, and it kind of defeats. So the earlier the better. But the key is not to leave them. People sometimes leave them on all year long, or leave them on forever, and then you get sediment and weeds growing on top, and it's just a mess.
You did it 5 weeks?
We did it 4 to 5 weeks, yeah.
Thank you very much.